My husband threw divorce papers onto my plate of smothered chicken during Sunday dinner, loudly declaring he was leaving me for a woman on his level, and told my mother to come pick up her useless daughter. He expected me to shatter into a million pieces and beg him to stay. Instead, I pointed out a legal typo in his cheap paperwork, and exactly 1 minute later, my mother pulled into our driveway with a convoy of 6 midnight black luxury SUVs, leaving my soon-to-be ex-husband utterly speechless. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to show someone the true cost of underestimating a woman who knows her worth. I am Zuri, and at 33 years old, I had mastered the dangerous art of making myself small so the man I loved could feel big. It was a warm Sunday afternoon in Atlanta, and the air inside our dining room was thick with the rich, savory aroma of the smothered chicken, candied yams, and collard greens. I had spent 4 painstaking hours preparing. The custom mahogany table was set perfectly with crystal glasses and linen napkins carefully arranged to impress. Surrounding this feast was my husband Terrence, along with his loud and notoriously difficult family. Terrence was 35, a corporate finance climber who wore his ambition like a heavy cologne. He loved sitting at the head of the table holding court, swirling his wine glass, just so projecting the image of a self-made king. I loved him enough to let him wear the crown even if I was the one secretly reinforcing the castle walls. For years, I had listened to him complain about the pressures of his job, the politics of his firm, and the disrespect he felt from his superiors. I played the supportive wife, offering back rubs and encouraging words, keeping my own professional life deliberately vague. Whenever his family asked what I did, I simply told them I did freelance consulting from the guest room. I allowed them to assume I was barely scraping by, taking on tiny administrative tasks just to have some pocket money. I did this because I knew how fragile Terrence could be when it came to his ego. He needed to feel like the breadwinner, the undeniable leader of our household, and I loved him too much to threaten that illusion. We were halfway through the main course, and the conversation was flowing, mostly dominated by Terrence boasting about a recent merger his firm was handling. His mother Vivian sat to his right, nodding along with a look of extreme pride, while his older brother Jamal and Jamal's white wife Ashley sat across from me, picking at their food. I was listening quietly, taking a bite of my chicken, when the atmosphere abruptly shattered. Terrence suddenly stood up, pushing his heavy wooden chair back so forcefully it scraped loudly against the imported hardwood floor. The entire table fell dead silent. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, a jacket I had quietly purchased for his promotion last year, and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. Without a single word of warning or a shred of basic human decency, he tossed it directly onto my plate. The envelope landed with a wet, heavy thud right on top of my meal, sending a splash of dark brown gravy flying across the pristine white tablecloth. I froze. Everyone froze. The sound of silverware clinking against porcelain ceased entirely, leaving only the low hum of the central air conditioning. Terrence looked down at me with a cold, calculated smirk that completely erased the man I had married 5 years ago. He squared his shoulders and announced to the crowded room that he was filing for divorce. He did not lower his voice or ask to speak to me in private. He wanted an audience. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to break me publicly in front of the very people who had always treated me like an outsider. He declared with terrifying casualness that he was leaving me for someone who actually understood his ambition. He proudly stated he needed a woman who was on his level, specifically naming the new junior partner at his corporate finance firm. He said he was tired of carrying the dead weight of a wife who spent her days sitting in her pajamas doing pretend freelance work while he went out and conquered the real corporate world. The silence that followed his declaration was suffocating. I could feel the eyes of his mother, his brother, and his sister-in-law burning into the side of my face, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They fully expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to scream, to throw my wine glass, to drop to my knees and beg him to reconsider. Terrence stood tall, bathing in the glow of his own perceived dominance, waiting for my world to end. But my world did not end. The deep, hollow ache of betrayal sparked briefly in my chest and was instantly incinerated by a sudden absolute clarity. I looked at the gravy-stained envelope sitting on my ruined dinner. Then I looked up at the man who had just tried to publicly humiliate me. I did not shed a single tear. My breathing remained perfectly even. I calmly picked up my folded linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and set the napkin carefully beside my plate. I picked up the envelope, wiping a smear of gravy off the corner with my thumb. I peeled open the metal clasp and slid out the thick stack of papers. The room was so quiet you could hear the rustle of the crisp white pages as I flipped through them. I scanned the first page, then the second. My analytical mind, trained by years of navigating high-stakes corporate bloodbaths, immediately caught the glaring errors. Terrence had not even hired a real attorney for this dramatic presentation. He had taken the cheap, cowardly route. I let out a soft, genuine chuckle that echoed through the tense dining room. Terrence shifted his weight, his confident smirk faltering just a fraction as confusion crept into his eyes. I looked up from the papers and met his gaze. "Terrence," I said, my voice steady and smooth, "if you are going to blindside your wife with divorce papers in front of your entire family, you should probably avoid downloading a free template from the internet." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the fourth paragraph of the second page. "You see here in subsection B, you have cited a family law statute that is only applicable in the state of California. We live in Georgia, Terrence. Furthermore, you failed to properly format the Asset Disclosure Annex, which makes this entire preliminary separation agreement legally unenforceable. You essentially just served me a very dramatic piece of trash." The color drained out of Terrence's face. His jaw tightened and I could see the veins pulsing in his neck. He had scripted this entire afternoon in his head, casting himself as the ruthless, successful executive shedding his mediocre wife. He had not prepared for me to grade his paperwork like a disappointed professor. He opened his mouth to snap back to reassert his dominance over the room, but he never got the chance. His family, realizing that I was not going to play, the weeping victim eagerly jumped in to finish the job he had started. The initial shock in the room quickly morphed into something far more hostile, as the people who had eaten my food and smiled to my face prepared to show me exactly who they had always been. The silence in the dining room stretched tight like a piano string about to snap. Terrence stood frozen at the head of the table, staring at the rejected divorce papers as if they had suddenly caught fire. He had expected me to crumble to beg for my place in his life. He had not expected a peer review of his fraudulent legal documents. But before he could recover his voice and mount a defense, the heavy, suffocating quiet was shattered by a sharp, dismissive laugh. It came from my right. Ashley leaned back in her custom-upholstered dining chair, swirling a heavy pour of my expensive Cabernet in her crystal glass. She was a woman who treated her marriage to Terrence's older brother Jamal as an entry ticket into what she perceived as black excellence. For 5 years, she had operated under the delusion that marrying into a family of mid-level corporate managers gave her the right to police my existence. "We always knew you could not keep up with this family's pedigree, Zuri," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar cloying sweetness she always used to mask her poison. "You can pack your thrift store clothes in garbage bags. I have some in the kitchen." I turned my head slowly to look at her, letting her words hang in the air. This was not the first time Ashley had weaponized her position in the family. My mind briefly flashed to a dozen similar moments. There was the Thanksgiving where she loudly suggested I should straighten my natural hair to look more professional for Terrence's sake. There was the family vacation where she handed me a bottle of discount drugstore lotion while she flaunted the luxury skincare Jamal had bought her. She had spent half a decade offering me backhanded compliments about how brave I was to wear unbranded clothing, completely oblivious to the fact that my tailored trousers cost more than her leased SUV. I practiced stealth wealth because I had actual wealth to protect. Ashley practiced loud consumption because she was drowning in credit card debt to maintain an illusion. Jamal sat right next to her, methodically cutting a piece of the smothered chicken I had cooked. He did not look up. He did not reprimand his wife for her blatant disrespect. He just kept chewing, completely complicit in his silence. This was the dynamic of their family. They protected their own, and they had always viewed me as an outsider who was lucky to be granted a seat at their table. I did not respond to Ashley. I did not need to. Her arrogance was a temporary condition that I was about to cure permanently. My refusal to rise to her bait seemed to agitate the room further. They wanted a screaming match. They wanted the angry black woman stereotype they could point to as justification for Terrence's betrayal. When I refused to give it to them, the matriarch of the family decided it was her turn to strike. Vivian slammed her hands down on the mahogany table, causing the silverware to rattle. She actually clapped her hands together, a wide, triumphant smile breaking across her face. Finally, she announced, projecting her voice as if she were delivering a sermon. Finally. Terrence needs a woman who actually works, not someone who sits in the guest room doing freelance consulting all day. Vivian shifted in her seat, her chest puffed out with maternal pride. She looked at her son as if he had just won a war rather than destroyed a marriage. She had raised Terrence and Jamal to believe they were absolute kings entitled to endless devotion and sacrifice from the women in their lives. From the moment Terrence and I got engaged, Vivian had made it her mission to remind me that I was falling short. She worshipped corporate titles and visible exhaustion. Because she could not see me commuting to a glass tower every morning, she had firmly categorized me as a lazy dependent. I know the junior partner Terrence is talking about. Vivian continued, turning her attention to the rest of the table, making sure everyone heard her validation of his infidelity. She is sharp. She is driven. She has a real career. She understands the kind of pressure my son is under. A man like Terrence needs a partner who can match his ambition, not a weight dragging him down. You have held him back long enough, Zuri. It is time for him to fly. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of her delusion. Vivian was sitting in a custom-built dining room, eating food paid for by my money, breathing air cooled by an HVAC system I maintained, basking in the luxury of a home she assumed her son provided. She looked around the room, admiring the crown molding and the expensive artwork, completely blind to the reality of her surroundings. She genuinely believed her son was the architect of this life. She believed his mid-level finance salary funded this $1.2 million property. She believed my quiet days in the guest room were spent playing on the internet, rather than managing a private equity portfolio that could buy and sell Terrence's entire firm before lunch. My silence must have looked like defeat to them. In their minds, I was the broken housewife paralyzed by the sudden loss of my provider. I watched Ashley smirk, taking another generous gulp of my wine. I watched Jamal continuing, pretending he was above the drama, while actively enjoying the spectacle. I watched Vivian nod approvingly at her son, validating his choice to humiliate me. They were piling on, eager to kick me, while they believed I was down. It was a fascinating psychological display. People who feel small always leap at the chance to crush someone they perceive as smaller. They were digging their own graves with every word they spoke, and I was more than happy to hand them the shovels. I did not defend my career. I did not defend my dignity. I simply reached for my glass of iced sweet tea and took a slow, deliberate sip. My absolute refusal to beg or cry acted like a powerful stimulant on Terrence. The slight panic he had felt when I dismantled his fake divorce papers vanished, replaced by a surging, arrogant confidence. His family had validated him. His mother had blessed his infidelity. His sister-in-law had insulted me on his behalf. He was the king of his castle once again. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his suit jacket with a sharp tug. He looked down at me, his eyes cold and devoid of any shared history. He mistook my calculated restraint for absolute submission. Empowered by the hostile energy of his family, and desperate to deliver the final crushing blow, Terrence reached into his pocket. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. He was not satisfied with merely leaving me. I needed to completely eradicate my presence, and he wanted to do it with maximum cruelty. He unlocked his screen and navigated to his contacts. He was about to make a call that would alter the trajectory of every single life in this room. He was about to summon the one person he thought would complete my humiliation. I watched his thumb press the call button, and I simply waited. Terrence tapped the screen of his phone and placed it carefully in the dead center of the dining table. It sat right next to the gravy-stained divorce papers he had just thrown at me. He pressed the speaker icon, ensuring every single person in the room would hear the destruction of my dignity. The loud, rhythmic dialing tone echoed against the custom crown molding of the dining room. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. With every ring, I watched his family lean in closer. Vivian actually placed her hands flat on the table, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. Ashley, my white sister-in-law, leaned her shoulder against Jamal, shifting her weight, so she had a perfect unobstructed view of my face. She wanted to see the exact moment my spirit broke. My mother answered on the fourth ring. Her voice came through the speaker crisp and entirely unbothered. "Hello, Terrence." Terrence did not offer a polite greeting. He did not extend the basic courtesy you would give to a stranger on the street, let alone the woman who had welcomed him into her family. He leaned forward over his untouched plate, resting his elbows on the linen tablecloth, and dropped his voice an octave. He was putting on his best corporate executive voice, the one he used when he was trying to intimidate junior analysts at his finance firm. "Maxine, I am calling to tell you that I am divorcing your daughter." He delivered the words with brutal efficiency. "You need to come pick her up right now. She is useless to me and I do not want her anymore." The cruelty of the phrasing hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Useless. I do not want her. He was speaking about me as if I were a defective appliance he was returning to a discount store. Vivian let out a soft sound of approval, a high-pitched hum that vibrated with maternal pride. She looked at her son, as if he were holding a sword having just slain a dragon. Jamal continued slicing his chicken, refusing to meet my eyes, choosing the coward's path of silent complicity. On the other end of the line, my mother did not gasp. She did not cry out. She simply let a brief beat of silence pass. Terrence, however, mistook her silence for shock. He took it as a sign of weakness, and fueled by the toxic validation of the people sitting around him, he decided to push the knife in all the way to the bone. "I am giving you exactly 30 minutes to get her and her cheap belongings out of my house." Terrence commanded, his voice rising in volume. "If she is not gone by 3 o'clock, I am calling a locksmith to change the deadbolts, and I am putting her garbage bags on the curb. I refuse to spend another night under the same roof as a woman who brings absolutely no value to my life." Ashley let out a sharp little laugh. She reached for her wineglass, muttering just loud enough for the table to hear. "Let us hope her mother can afford the gas to get here." She smirked at her own joke, reveling in the opportunity to flaunt her perceived superiority. Ashley had built her entire identity around being the white wife of an upwardly mobile black man. She viewed her marriage to Jamal as a permanent elevation in her social status, and she aggressively guarded that status by constantly trying to push me down. Terrence heard her comment and smiled. He leaned closer to the phone, eager to perform for his audience. "In fact, Maxine, I suggest you go ahead and fire up that broken-down Honda Civic you are so incredibly proud of and get over here right now. Maybe you can dip into that miserable public school teacher pension of yours to rent her a cheap apartment on your side of town, because she will not be seeing a single dime of my money." She failed to elevate herself to my level. She refused to build a real career, and I absolutely refuse to be dragged back down to the poverty you people come from. His words were a masterclass in aggressive elitism and staggering ignorance. Terrence had met my mother 5 years ago when we first started dating. At the time, she was driving an old silver Honda Civic and living in a modest brick house in a working-class neighborhood. She wore practical shoes and simple sweaters. She told him she was a retired high school math teacher. Terrence, being a man obsessed with designer labels and visible status, immediately categorized her as beneath him. He looked down on her frugality. He despised what he perceived as her lower-class background. He felt a deep-seated need to distance himself from anything that did not scream generational wealth. What Terrence never bothered to learn, because his arrogance prevented him from ever asking, was why a retired public school math teacher was so obsessed with numbers. He never knew that Maxine had spent her evenings teaching herself complex financial modeling. He never knew that she had taken her modest teacher savings and aggressively invested in early-stage technology startups right before the market exploded. He never knew that the woman he was currently screaming at over speakerphone had quietly built a venture capital empire that dictated the financial futures of men just like him. He just saw a black woman he could easily disrespect. "Terrence," Maxine said finally. Her voice was perfectly level, completely devoid of the panic or heartbreak he was so desperately trying to provoke. It was the calm, dangerous tone of a woman who was holding a lit match over a powder keg. "Are you entirely sure this is the path you want to take today?" Terence scoffed, throwing his head back. I am the man of this house, Maxine. My decision is final. You have 28 minutes left. Do not make me call the police to have your daughter removed for trespassing. He slammed his index finger down on the red end call button, disconnecting the line with a sharp digital chirp. The screen went black. Terence exhaled a long breath, adjusting his suit jacket, and picked up his wine glass. He took a victorious sip, surveying his family. Well, Vivian said, smoothing her napkin across her lap. That was certainly direct, but completely necessary. You handled that like a true leader, Terence. Sometimes you just have to cut the dead weight loose so you can finally soar. She turned her sharp gaze toward me. You heard him, Zuri. I suggest you go upstairs and start gathering your things. We would not want you to cause any more embarrassment for this family than you already have. Ashley leaned her shoulder against Jamal, twirling a piece of blonde hair around her finger. Honestly, Zuri, you should be grateful he gave you a half-hour warning. If I were him, I would have tossed your things out on the lawn yesterday. I just hope your mother does not leak motor oil all over our pristine driveway when she pulls up. The homeowners association is very strict about that sort of thing. They were all staring at me, waiting for the tears, waiting for the desperate pleas for mercy, waiting for me to shatter into a million jagged pieces right there in my own dining room. They wanted me to perform my assigned role as the discarded, useless wife. They wanted to consume my pain as the final course of their Sunday dinner. I did not give them a single drop of satisfaction. I sat perfectly still in my custom-upholstered chair, feeling the cool air of the room brush against my skin. I looked at Terence, who was grinning like a conqueror. I looked at Vivian, who was glowing with maternal triumph. I looked at Ashley, whose racist, classist audacity had just sealed her own miserable fate. I looked at Jamal, the silent coward. I took them all in, capturing this exact image in my mind, because I wanted to remember exactly how arrogant they looked right before their entire reality collapsed. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around my crystal glass of iced sweet tea. Condensation dripped down the sides, pooling onto the linen tablecloth. I brought the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cold liquid slide down my throat. I swallowed. I set the glass down with a soft, precise clink that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I lifted my left arm, pushing back the sleeve of my blouse, and looked at the face of my watch. It was a custom timepiece, a quiet luxury item that cost more than Terence earned in a fiscal quarter. I watched the second hand tick forward. You gave her 30 minutes, I said, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly level. I met Terence's eyes, watching the first tiny flicker of confusion breach his arrogant facade. But you see, Terence, my mother does not drive a Honda Civic anymore, and she absolutely does not like to wait. Right as the words left my mouth, the heavy, synchronized thud of multiple car doors slamming shut echoed violently from the driveway outside. The heavy metallic thud of doors shutting in precise unison reverberated through the glass of the bay windows, shaking the crystal chandelier hanging over our dining table. The vibration was so distinct it caused the wine in Terence's glass to ripple. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. The arrogant sneer on Terence's face froze into a grotesque mask of confusion. Ashley stopped mid-sip, her glass hovering inches from her lips. Even Vivian, who had been leaning back in her chair like a queen receiving tribute, straightened up and frowned at the front window. Jamal was the first to stand. He pushed his chair back and walked toward the bay window, peering out through the sheer linen curtains into the fading evening light. His eyes widened, and the color drained from his face so fast it looked like he had seen a ghost. What the hell is that? Terence muttered, his voice losing that booming authoritative tone he had used just moments ago. Is that the police? Did you call the cops, Zuri? I did not say a word. I simply sat there, relaxed in my chair, holding my crystal glass with both hands. Terence stood up, almost knocking over his own glass, and rushed to the window beside his brother. Ashley and Vivian followed right behind him, unable to contain their curiosity. What they saw out on our quiet, tree-lined suburban driveway instantly shattered the frail illusion of superiority they had spent the last 5 years building around themselves. Positioned in a flawless tactical formation across our front yard and driveway were 6 midnight black long-wheelbase Cadillac Escalades. Their dark paint was so polished it reflected the streetlights like mirrors, and their limousine-tinted windows completely obscured who was inside. They had not just pulled up into the driveway. They had executed a coordinated maneuver that completely boxed in Terrence's white-leased BMW. His prized vehicle, the car he washed every Saturday morning and bragged about to anyone who would listen, now looked like an insignificant plastic toy trapped between 6 armored tanks. Ashley gasped, her manicured hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, Jamal, who are those people? Is that the HOA? Is someone getting raided?" Jamal did not answer her. He was staring at the vehicles with the trained eyes of someone who worked in corporate logistics. He knew those cars did not belong to the local police department. They did not belong to any local municipal service either. That was a motorcade, the kind reserved for foreign dignitaries, high-level federal officials, or elite corporate executives who traveled with heavy private security details. Before anyone in the room could process the sight, the doors of the trailing 3 SUVs swung open simultaneously. From each vehicle stepped men dressed in matching tailored charcoal black suits. They wore discreet earpieces with coiled wires stretching up beneath their collars. They did not shout. They did not draw weapons. They simply moved with effortless military precision, taking up strategic positions along the perimeter of our front lawn, guarding the walkway, and standing at the end of the driveway. Terrence's breathing became shallow. His chest heaved beneath his suit jacket. He spun around from the window to glare at me, his face a mixture of rising panic and furious disbelief. "Zuri, what did you do?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly on my name. "Who are those people? What kind of shady business are you mixed up in? Did you bring criminals to my house?" I leaned back against my chair, crossing one leg over the other. The utter absurdity of his accusation made me smile. Terrence was so deeply trapped in his own narrow worldview that he could not fathom a scenario where a black family possessed legitimate, overwhelming power. To him, the only way anyone could afford 6 brand-new luxury SUVs and a full security team was through illegal activity. He had spent years categorizing my mother and me as poor, uneducated, and irrelevant, so his brain was frantically trying to protect his fragile ego from the truth unfolding on his front lawn. I looked at him with cool amusement. "You just told my mother to come pick up her useless daughter, Terrence. I told you she was already outside. Why are you acting so surprised?" "That is impossible," Terrence yelled, pointing a trembling finger toward the window. "Your mother drives a 15-year-old Civic. She draws a retired teacher pension. She cannot afford those cars. Those are $130,000 apiece, Zuri. That is nearly $1 million in vehicles sitting on my grass." Ashley turned around from the window, her face flushed red with a sudden spike of anger and humiliation. Her white picket fence fantasy was crumbling right before her eyes. She had spent the last hour treating me like a charity case, offering me trash bags for my clothes and making derogatory comments about my mother's car. Now she was staring at a display of wealth that surpassed anything her husband's family had ever seen, let alone owned. "This is ridiculous!" Ashley spat out, her voice high-pitched and strained. "This is a quiet neighborhood. They are parking on the grass. They are blocking the driveway. Jamal, go out there and tell them to move. They cannot just park those giant trucks all over the lawn. The neighbors are going to call the board." Jamal did not move an inch. He was not stupid. He saw the way the men in suits stood, hands folded casually in front of them, eyes scanning the street with absolute professionalism. He knew if he walked out there trying to assert his fake authority, he would be dismissed like a minor inconvenience. Vivian stepped closer to her favorite son, clutching Terrence's arm. Her confidence had evaporated, replaced by a deep, unsettling anxiety. "Terrence, baby, what is happening? Who is out there?" Terrence swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. He smoothed down his tie, squared his shoulders, and tried to summon the arrogant corporate executive persona he wore at his office. He convinced himself that as the man of the house he was still in control of this situation. "It does not matter who they are," Terrence declared, though his voice lacked the booming authority it had 10 minutes ago. "This is my property. My name is on the lease agreement for this land. Nobody comes onto my property and intimidates me in front of my family." He turned and began marching toward the foyer, determined to open the front door and demand answers. But before his hand could even touch the brass doorknob, the heavy wooden front door was opened from the outside. One of the lead security guards, A broad-shouldered black man over 6 feet tall, with an unreadable expression, held the door wide open. He did not say a word to Terence. He simply stepped to the side, creating a clear pathway from the driveway into our dining hall. Outside the door of the primary lead escalade opened. A man in a sleek dark suit stepped out first, holding a large umbrella to shield the passenger from the evening air. He reached out and opened the rear passenger door. The dining room fell into a dead, breathless silence. Nobody breathed, nobody spoke. From the back seat of the vehicle, a single flawless designer patent leather heel stepped out and planted itself firmly on the concrete pavement. The second patent leather heel met the concrete. Then my mother emerged from the shadowy interior of the flagship Escalade. Maxine was a vision of absolute, unadulterated power. She wore a flawless floor-length camel hair coat that draped over her shoulders like royal armor. Beneath it, a tailored charcoal pantsuit spoke of boardrooms and nine-figure acquisitions. A single strand of perfectly matched South Sea pearls rested at her collarbone, reflecting the dim light of the suburban street lamps. Her hair was styled in a sharp, immaculate silk press that defied the humid Georgia evening. She did not look like a retired public school teacher. She looked like a woman who could buy the entire neighborhood and pave it over just for the parking space. Flanking her were 4 men whose sheer physical dimensions made our spacious driveway suddenly look cramped. They wore crisp dark suits, discreet earpieces, and moved with the silent predatory grace of highly trained professionals. They fanned out with military precision, securing the perimeter of the property and blocking any possible exit. But my eyes were drawn to the woman walking one step behind my mother's right shoulder. Kendra. Kendra was my mother's lead corporate attorney, a razor-sharp black woman whose reputation in the financial district was nothing short of legendary. Kendra carried a thick leather briefcase and wore an expression of terminal boredom, as if dismantling arrogant men on a Sunday evening was simply another administrative task on her busy calendar. Inside the dining room, the air turned completely stagnant. I watched Terence swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against the tight collar of his dress shirt. He had spent the last 5 years painting a mental portrait of my mother as a struggling, tired pensioner, counting coupons and driving a rattling sedan. His brain was misfiring violently, unable to reconcile his fabricated narrative with the terrifyingly wealthy matriarch currently striding up his front walkway. Ashley took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the antique mahogany credenza. Her wine sloshed over the rim of her glass, staining her pale fingers red, but she did not even notice. For years, Ashley had wielded her whiteness and her husband's corporate salary as a bludgeon against me, treating me like a charity case who should be grateful for her table scraps. Now she was staring at a display of generational wealth and untouchable black excellence that instantly reduced her to absolute insignificance. Her entire social hierarchy was crumbling in real time. The heavy oak front door was already open, held wide by one of the security personnel. The rhythmic click of my mother's heels echoed through the foyer and spilled into the dining room. She did not knock. She did not wait for an invitation. She simply crossed the threshold and claimed the oxygen in the room. Terence's mother, Vivian, remained frozen in her custom-upholstered chair. 10 minutes ago, Vivian had been glowing with maternal triumph, celebrating my disposal and cheering for a junior partner who supposedly matched her son's pedigree. Now Vivian looked like she had been turned to stone. Her eyes darted frantically from my mother's designer coat to the towering security guards blocking the foyer. Maxine did not look at Terence. She did not look at Jamal or Ashley. She bypassed the men entirely and locked her dark, piercing eyes directly onto Vivian. It was a mother-to-mother showdown, a confrontation of matriarchs, and Vivian was entirely outmatched. "I let my daughter play house with you lot because she believed in humility," Maxine said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was smooth, resonant, and carried the chilling weight of a woman who destroyed corporations for a living. She believed that love required sacrifice, and that building a man up was an honorable pursuit. But since you have decided to mistake her grace for weakness, the charade is over. Vivian's mouth opened and closed silently before she finally managed to force out a trembling breath. "Maxine." She stammered, her fingers gripping the edge of the dining table so hard her knuckles turned white. "What is the meaning of this? How did you get those cars? You are a retired public school teacher. You drive a Honda. My mother let out a soft, rich laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a beautiful, terrifying sound. Vivian, my mother said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. I was a public school math teacher 30 years ago. What your arrogant son failed to realize because he was too busy looking down his nose at my sensible shoes is that teaching calculus translates exceptionally well to building predictive financial algorithms. Maxine paused, letting her words sink into the suffocating silence of the room. When I retired from teaching, I took my pension, and I invested it aggressively in early-stage technology startups right before the market exploded. I built a venture capital empire, Vivian. I buy and sell firms exactly like the one your son works for. I drove that 15-year-old Honda Civic to Sunday dinners specifically because I wanted to see how you and your boys would treat a black woman you thought had nothing. And you all failed the test spectacularly. The revelation hit the room with the force of a physical blow. Jamal let out a ragged breath, stepping back until his shoulders hit the wall. Ashley looked like she was going to be sick, her eyes darting frantically between my mother's pearls and the stern, assessing face of Kendra, the attorney. Vivian slumped back in her chair, the maternal arrogance completely drained from her features, leaving behind only stark terror. My mother had just revealed that she held the kind of power they had only ever dreamed of tasting. But Terrence could not accept it. His entire identity was inextricably tied to his perceived financial dominance. His toxic masculinity, his towering ego, his desperate need to be the smartest, wealthiest man in the room would not allow him to process the reality standing right in front of him. If he accepted that my mother was a venture capital titan, it meant he was not the king he thought he was. It meant he had been entirely wrong about the woman he married. It meant he was not the prize. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He snapped out of his stunned paralysis and lunged forward, breaking the invisible barrier of respect my mother's presence commanded. He puffed his chest out aggressively, attempting to physically intimidate a woman who had 4 armed guards standing just 10 feet away. "I do not care what kind of tech money you think you have," Terrence shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "You do not come into my home and disrespect my mother. You do not march an armed squad onto my property and talk down to my family." He pointed a shaking finger directly at my mother's face. He was relying on the one thing he believed gave him absolute, unquestionable authority: his paycheck, his corporate title, the financial contribution he believed held our entire marriage together and paid for the roof over our heads. He desperately needed to remind everyone in the room that he was the provider. "I am the man of this house," Terrence roared, the veins bulging prominently in his neck. "I pay the mortgage on this property. I work 60 hours a week, bleeding for my firm to keep the lights on and to afford these luxuries. I make the rules here, Maxine, not you. And my rule is that you take her and her pathetic freelance junk out of my house right this second." Howe was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides, desperately trying to reclaim the narrative he had lost. He glared at me, then back at my mother, trying to summon the corporate ruthlessness he so desperately wanted to embody. "I am giving you one last chance to pack up her trash and get off my driveway before I call the police and have you all arrested for trespassing," he sneered. "She brings absolutely nothing to the table. She is a drain on my hard-earned resources. Take your useless daughter and get out of my house." My mother did not flinch at his screaming. She did not raise her voice or offer a single syllable of defense against his baseless accusations. She simply stood there, radiating an aura of untouchable authority, and slowly blinked. Then she tilted her chin just a fraction of an inch to her right. That was the only signal Kendra needed. Kendra stepped past the threshold of the dining room, her immaculate black stiletto heels clicking against the imported hardwood floors with the measured cadence of a ticking time bomb. She bypassed Terrence completely, as if he were nothing more than a minor obstruction in a hallway, and stopped directly at the head of the mahogany table. She opened her slim leather briefcase, drawing out a thick document printed on heavy watermarked legal paper. She extended her hand, offering the document to Terrence. He stared at it for a second, his chest still heaving from his pathetic display of false bravado, before he snatched it from her grasp. He ripped open the heavy seal, his eyes darting across the dense paragraphs of legal text. "That is a formal cease and desist order drafted and executed by my firm," Kendra said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a razor-sharp frequency that cut through the lingering hostility in the room. It legally prohibits you from altering, removing, destroying, or otherwise disposing of a single asset located within the perimeter of this property. It also strictly forbids you from initiating any further verbal, written, or physical harassment against my client Maxine or her daughter Zuri. Should you attempt to follow through on your incredibly ill-advised threat to place Zuri's belongings in garbage bags or change the locks on these doors, you will be in direct violation of a court-sanctioned mandate. I will personally see to it that you are held in contempt, and I promise you, Terrence, the financial penalties will eclipse your annual salary before you even secure legal representation. Terrence's eyes widened as he scanned the paper. His legal knowledge was limited to corporate finance mergers, not aggressive civil litigation, but even he could recognize the aggressive ironclad language of a top-tier law firm preparing to annihilate an opponent. He swallowed hard, the paper trembling slightly in his grip. Ashley, watching her brother-in-law being verbally eviscerated by a black woman in a power suit, suddenly felt the desperate need to reclaim some fragment of control. Her entire social hierarchy was crumbling, and her proximity to Terrence's perceived power was her only shield. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone, holding it up with the camera lens pointed squarely at Kendra and my mother. Her thumb hovered over the record button, a smug, self-satisfied grin stretching across her face. "Oh, I am definitely recording this," Ashley announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and toxic entitlement. "You people think you can just march in here and threaten my family. We will see how tough you act when this goes viral. Let the whole world see this little ghetto breakdown you are trying to stage. My country club friends are going to love seeing the reality of who Terrence actually married." She wanted the stereotype. She desperately craved the image of an angry, out-of-control black woman screaming at the camera so she could play the victimized, innocent bystander. She wanted to post a heavily edited clip to her social media to garner sympathy and validate the deep-seated racism she had poorly masked for the last 5 years. Kendra did not shout. She did not swat at the camera. She slowly turned her head and fixed Ashley with a stare so cold it could have frozen boiling water. "I strongly suggest you put that device away," Ashley, Kendra advised, her tone dropping to a lethal calm. "Georgia is a one-party consent state for recording conversations. However, you are currently standing on private property, attempting to record individuals without their explicit consent for the stated purpose of public defamation. If you press that red button, I will file a civil suit against you for invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and cyber harassment before the video even finishes uploading to your server." Ashley hesitated, her thumb hovering frozen over the screen. Her smug smile faltered, but she stubbornly kept the camera raised, trying to call what she assumed was a bluff. "You cannot sue me for filming in my brother-in-law's house," Ashley shot back, though her voice lacked its previous confident ring. "I know my rights." Kendra took a slow, deliberate step toward Ashley. "I know everything about your finances," Ashley, Kendra stated flatly. "I know about the $50,000 in revolving credit card debt you are currently hiding from Jamal. I know about the second mortgage you took out on your heavily leveraged suburban home to finance your luxury vehicle. I know that if I file a defamation suit naming you as the primary defendant, your husband's modest logistical salary will not cover the retainer for a defense attorney, let alone the devastating damages I will extract from you in court. You will lose your car. You will lose your house. You will be forced to explain to your country club friends why you are suddenly shopping at discount grocery stores. Now I will give you exactly 3 seconds to lower that phone, or I will consider your recording active, and I will begin drafting the lawsuit." 1. Ashley's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. She looked frantically at Jamal, silently pleading for him to step in and defend her. Jamal looked away, fixing his gaze on the far wall, utterly terrified of drawing Kendra's attention to himself. He abandoned his wife exactly the way he had abandoned me moments earlier. 2. Kendra counted, her gaze unblinking. Ashley practically dropped the phone, throwing it face down onto the dining table as if the device had suddenly caught fire. She shrank back into her chair, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, thoroughly humiliated and completely neutralized. Terrence, watching his sister-in-law fold under the pressure, snapped, The presence of these powerful women stripping away his authority in his own dining room pushed him over the edge of rational thought. He crumpled the cease and desist order in his fist and threw it onto the floor, pointing an aggressive finger at me. "You think this scares me?" Terrence roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You think bringing your mother and her attack dog lawyer into my house changes anything? I am the one who built this life. I am the one who works day and night to afford this property. Do you have any idea how much money leaves my bank account every single month to keep this roof over your head?" He began pacing at the head of the table, gesturing wildly at the custom molding, the imported chandelier, and the expansive bay windows. "I pay for the electricity that cools this room. I pay the property taxes. I pay the massive mortgage on this $1.2 million estate. I provide the lifestyle that allows you to sit around doing nothing all day. You bring zero financial value to this marriage. Zuri, you are a dependent, a liability. And I will not stand here and be threatened in the very house that my hard-earned corporate salary secures." He stopped pacing, planting his feet firmly, and glaring down at me, his chest heaving. He was clinging desperately to the singular narrative that defined his manhood. The illusion of being the sole provider, the financial king of the castle. He needed me to be small so he could be large. I listened to his entire rant without interrupting. I let him lay out every single delusion he held about our life together. I let him paint himself into the tightest corner possible. Then I placed my hands flat on the edge of the mahogany table and I finally stood up. The physical act of rising from my chair felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin. For 5 years, I had dulled my own shine, lowered my own volume, and hidden my own massive success, just to protect the fragile ego of the man standing across from me. I had played the role of the quiet, supportive wife entirely too well. That performance ended right now. I reached up with my right hand and grasped the platinum wedding band on my left ring finger. The diamond caught the light of the chandelier as I slid the metal over my knuckle. I held the ring for a fraction of a second, feeling the weight of the last 5 years of my life. Then I tossed it onto the table. It landed next to his ruined divorce papers with a sharp metallic clatter. I looked Terrence dead in the eyes, watching his arrogant fury collide with my absolute icy indifference. "You do not pay the mortgage, Terrence," I said, my voice ringing with undeniable, terrifying clarity. "You pay rent, to me." I did not wait for Terrence to process the words I had just spoken. I reached down into my leather tote bag resting against the leg of my chair and pulled out my tablet. The dining room was equipped with a massive 85-inch smart television mounted on the far wall directly above the antique credenza. Terrence loved that television. He had bought it specifically to watch football on Sundays and constantly bragged to his friends about the picture quality and the surround sound system. I tapped the screen of my tablet twice, bringing up the mirroring function, and sent my display directly to the television. The massive screen flickered to life, casting a bright, harsh white glow across the faces of my soon-to-be former family. On the screen was a high-resolution scan of a property deed. The official seal of Fulton County sat clearly in the top right corner. I zoomed in on the property address, making sure the bold black text was large enough for Vivian and Ashley to read from across the room. It was this exact house. The $1.2 million suburban estate Terrence had just spent 5 minutes screaming about owning. I panned the image down to the ownership details, highlighting the section that listed the sole proprietor. It did not say Terrence. It did not say my name either. It read Zenith Holdings LLC in clear, undeniable print. Terrence stared at the screen, his eyes squinting against the glare, as if the text were written in a foreign language. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of confusion and residual anger. "What is Zenith Holdings? Who owns this property, Zuri?" I placed my tablet flat on the mahogany dining table, right next to the discarded wedding ring. "Zenith Holdings is a private equity firm," I replied, keeping my tone as conversational and light as if I were discussing the weather. "It specializes in aggressive corporate acquisitions and high-yield asset management across the southeastern United States. It currently manages a portfolio worth just under $200 million. And Terrence, I am the sole proprietor. I own 100% of the shares. I am Zenith Holdings, Vivian let out a sharp, audible gasp, clutching her chest, as if she had just been physically struck. Ashley leaned so far forward in her chair she nearly knocked over her wine glass. You told us you did freelance consulting in the guest room. Vivian stammered, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. You told us you did basic administrative work online. I did, I confirmed, meeting her terrified gaze without blinking. I consulted on corporate buyouts, and I administrated the liquidation of failing mid-tier financial institutions. I did it from the guest room because I preferred the natural light in there. And I kept it exceptionally quiet because I knew exactly how fragile your son's ego was. I turned my attention back to Terrence, who was now staring at me like he was looking at a stranger. 3 years ago, when we decided to move out of our starter apartment, you insisted on buying this specific house in this specific gated community. You wanted this exact address to impress the senior partners at your firm. The only problem, Terrence, was that you could not afford it. Your debt-to-income ratio was an absolute disaster because you insisted on leasing luxury vehicles you had no business driving just to keep up appearances. The bank laughed at your mortgage application. You were so devastated, so utterly humiliated by the rejection from the loan officers that you locked yourself in the bedroom for 2 days, refusing to eat. I loved you back then. I loved you enough to want to protect your pride and shield you from your own financial incompetence. So I made a few phone calls. I used Zenith Holdings to purchase this entire estate in cash. It took exactly 4 days to clear underwriting. When the realtor handed you the keys and told you the financing had miraculously been approved by a private luxury lender, you did not even question it. You were too busy patting yourself on the back to read the actual closing documents. You just assumed your charm and your middle management salary had somehow pulled off a miracle. Terrence's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was visibly suffocating under the weight of his own profound ignorance. But the money, he finally choked out, his voice sounding incredibly thin and hollow in the large room. I pay $4,000 a month for the mortgage. The money comes out of my checking account every single month. I have the bank statements, Zuri. I pay for this house. You transfer $4,000 a month into an escrow account that I manage. I corrected him, meticulously, enunciating every single syllable. That money does not go to a bank, Terrence. It does not go toward principal or interest. It goes directly into my corporate holding account. I let you make those transfers every month because you needed to feel like the man of the house. You needed to believe you were providing for me. You needed to play the role of the wealthy, powerful breadwinner, and I graciously built you the $1.2 million sandbox to play in. I watched the realization wash over his features. I watched him mentally rewind the last 3 years of his life. Every summer barbecue he hosted in the backyard, bragging to his colleagues about his real estate investment. Every time he complained about the cost of maintaining the property, while I quietly paid the landscaping and contracting bills from my corporate accounts. Every single time he told me I needed to respect his authority because he was the one putting a roof over my head. You do not pay a mortgage, Terrence, I said, delivering the final devastating blow. You pay me rent, and as of this afternoon, your lease is officially terminated. The psychological collapse was immediate and absolute. The realization hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. Every boast he had made at this table, every arrogant comment he had thrown at my mother, every single ounce of superiority he had projected to justify his infidelity, was entirely fabricated. He was not a king, he was a tenant. How was a tenant, who had just proudly announced he was bringing his mistress to his landlord's property and expected to kick the landlord out onto the street? The foundation of his entire identity, his financial dominance, was completely obliterated in front of the very people he spent his entire life trying to impress. His knees simply gave out. The rigid, arrogant posture he had maintained all evening vanished completely as his legs lost the physical ability to support his weight. Terrence collapsed backward, dropping heavily into his custom-upholstered dining chair with a dull thud. He stared blankly at the massive television screen, where the deed to my house hovered brightly in the dimming room, acting like a glowing tombstone, marking the sudden violent death of his ego. The silence that followed Terence collapsing into his chair was thick enough to cut with a knife. For 5 years, I had watched the people in this room parade their false superiority around my home, acting as if they were royalty and I was the court jester. Now the absolute gravity of their profound ignorance was crushing them flat against the imported hardwood floors. The giant television screen continued to glow, casting a harsh bright light on the property deed that proved I owned every single square inch of the ground they were standing on. Vivian was the first to attempt a recovery. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life climbing social ladders and manipulating situations to ensure her own comfort. She possessed the unique survival instinct of a parasite always looking for the largest host to latch onto. As her brain finally processed the numbers I had just spoken, a $200 million portfolio, and a house paid for entirely in cash, her entire demeanor underwent a terrifyingly rapid transformation. The sneer of maternal triumph she had been wearing just moments ago melted off her face. She smoothed her hands down the front of her dress and forcibly rearranged her features into an expression of deep, warm maternal affection. She stood up from her chair, taking a slow, tentative step toward me, her hands clasped together in front of her chest. "Zuri, sweetheart." Vivian began, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Daughter, there has clearly been a massive misunderstanding here today." I did not move an inch. I simply stared at her, watching the desperation leak out from behind her eyes. "Terence has been under so much pressure at work," Vivian continued, waving a dismissive hand toward her son, who was still staring blankly at the floor. "You know how these corporate jobs test a man's sanity. He is exhausted. He is confused. That junior partner woman at his firm, she is a predator, Zuri. She must have manipulated my boy, cast some kind of spell on him to make him act this way. We both know Terence would never throw away a brilliant, beautiful, successful woman like you. You are family, Zuri. You are my daughter." I let a short, cold laugh escape my lips. The sheer audacity of her pivot was almost impressive, and minutes ago she was cheering for my disposal. She had explicitly praised the junior partner, claiming Terence needed a woman on his level who actually worked. Now, because she realized my bank account had 9 digits, that same junior partner was a predator, and I was suddenly her beloved daughter. "I am useless, remember, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that stopped her dead in her tracks. Vivian flinched, her eyes darting nervously toward my mother, who was standing silently by the doorway, flanked by her security team. No, I never said that," Vivian stammered, backtracking so fast she was practically tripping over her own words. "I just meant that a woman with your incredible talents shouldn't be hiding in the guest room. I always knew you were destined for greatness, Zuri. I was just trying to push you to reach your full potential. You were trying to crush my spirit, because my quiet humility made your loud arrogance feel cheap." I corrected her sharply, slicing through her pathetic lies. "You worshipped a corporate title so much that you completely missed the empire sitting right under your nose. You do not get to call me daughter, Vivian. You lost that privilege the second you clapped your hands and celebrated the destruction of my marriage. Do not take another step toward me." Vivian froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. She slowly sank back into her chair, realizing that her usual manipulation tactics were completely useless against a woman who held absolute power. With the matriarch effectively neutralized, I turned my attention to the right side of the table. Ashley had gone completely rigid. The color had drained so thoroughly from her face that she practically blended in with the white linen tablecloth. She was gripping her crystal wineglass so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Ashley was a woman whose entire personality was built on the foundation of her husband Jamal, making a low 6-figure salary. She wielded that modest income like a weapon specifically against me. For years she had utilized her position as the white sister-in-law to a supposedly successful black family to execute a flawless campaign of racial and classist microaggressions. She had made a hobby out of offering me unwanted advice on how to stretch a budget, how to shop clearance sales, and how to present myself more acceptably in upper-middle-class society. She had just told me to pack my thrift store clothes in garbage bags. Now she was sitting in a $1.2 million estate owned entirely by the black woman she had spent half a decade treating like the hired help. I looked at her designer handbag sitting on the empty chair beside her. It was a flashy logo cover piece she had undoubtedly purchased at an outlet mall or financed on a high-interest credit card just to project the illusion of wealth. Then I looked down at my own simple unbranded trousers. "You know, Ashley," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "You were right about one thing. My clothes do not come from the places you shop. But that is because bespoke tailoring from private designers in Milan does not come with price tags you can put on a payment plan." Ashley swallowed hard, tearing her eyes away from the television screen to look at me. Her bottom lip was trembling. She was experiencing the rapid, terrifying collapse of her entire social hierarchy. She had always viewed her marriage to Jamal as an elevation in status, putting her safely above the quiet black woman who did not flaunt her money. But the reality had just crashed down on her. She was infinitely inferior in every single metric she valued. "I do not need your garbage bags, Ashley," I continued, stepping closer to where she sat. "And I certainly do not need your condescending advice on how to navigate a neighborhood that I could buy and bulldoze tomorrow if the mood struck me. You have spent 5 years masquerading as the affluent savior in a family that you thought you were better than. But look at you now. You are sitting at my table drinking my expensive wine, trembling, because you realize that the woman you have been mocking is the landlord of the very reality you are desperately trying to cling to." Ashley shrank back in her chair, pressing her shoulder against Jamal as if trying to merge into his body. But Jamal was no help. He was staring at his plate, absolutely terrified to draw my attention or the attention of the imposing security team standing just a few feet away. He had enabled his wife's toxic behavior for years, allowing her to disrespect me because it made him feel powerful by association. Now he was completely paralyzed, stripped of his false authority. The utter dismantling of his mother and his sister-in-law finally snapped Terrence out of his catatonic state. He watched the two women who had always fueled his arrogance get verbally eviscerated and left with absolutely no defense. But instead of feeling shame or remorse, the sheer volume of wealth that had just been revealed began to trigger something entirely different in Terrence. His shock rapidly mutated into an aggressive, desperate greed. He was losing his status, his home, and his perceived dominance, but his corporate finance brain was actively crunching the numbers I had just displayed on the screen. A $200 million portfolio, a massive private equity firm, a house owned outright in cash. Terrence's hands balled into tight fists on his lap. The humiliation of being exposed as a fraud was suddenly eclipsed by the realization that he was legally married to a woman worth more money than he could earn in 10 lifetimes. He did not care about the lies he had told. He did not care about the mistress he had proudly announced just 20 minutes earlier. He only cared about the assets. He gripped the armrests of his chair and pushed himself up to a standing position. His face was flushed a dark, furious red, and the veins in his forehead were pulsing violently. He threw his shoulders back, trying to summon the intimidating presence that had completely failed him thus far. "You think you are so smart, Zuri?" Terrence roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. "You think you can just humiliate me in front of my family and walk away holding all the cards? You hid assets from your own husband. You ran a massive corporation behind my back and lied about your income for 5 years." I took a heavy step toward me, kicking his empty chair out of the way. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger directly at my face, his eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "We are legally married," Terrence screamed, spit flying from his lips as he grasped at the only legal lifeline he thought he had. "Everything you built during this marriage is marital property. The law does not care if you put it in an LLC, and the law does not care what you name your little holding company. What is yours is mine. Zuri, I am entitled to half of that estate. I am entitled to half of this house, and I am entitled to half of Zenith Holdings. You are going to cut me a check for $50 million before I even think about signing those divorce papers." Terrence's demand for $50 million hit the walls of the dining room and fell flat against the imported rug. He stood there, panting, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own frantic greed. He truly believed he had found his saving grace. In his mind, the law was a safety net designed to protect men just like him. He assumed that because we had stood in front of a pastor and signed a marriage certificate, he was automatically entitled to the fruits of my silent, invisible labor. I thought his wedding band was a winning lottery ticket. I did not flinch at his shouting. I did not even bother to answer his ridiculous demand. I simply shifted my gaze to my right and gave a slight nod to Kendra. Kendra stepped forward and a slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. It was the smile of an apex predator who had just cornered her prey. She reached into her slim leather briefcase and pulled out a single pristine manila folder. It looked identical to the garbage divorce papers Terrence had thrown at me earlier, but the contents of Kendra's folder carried the weight of a legal guillotine. Actually, Terrence, Kendra said, her voice echoing with clinical precision. You are not entitled to half of this estate. You are not entitled to half of Zenith Holdings. In fact, you are not entitled to a single solitary dime from my client's corporate or personal accounts. Terrence scoffed, aggressively crossing his arms over his chest. You are full of it, he snapped. Georgia is an equitable distribution state. Whatever she built while we were married is marital property subject to division. You can try to intimidate me with your power suits and your security guards, but I know my rights. I will drag her through discovery, and I will take half of everything. Kendra let out a soft, chilling laugh. You would be absolutely correct, Terrence, if you had not enthusiastically signed away every single one of those rights exactly 24 months ago. The smug defiance on Terrence's face faltered. He uncrossed his arms, a flicker of genuine confusion replacing his anger. What are you talking about? I never signed a prenuptial agreement. We got married 5 years ago. I did not sign anything. You did not sign a prenuptial agreement, Kendra corrected him, stepping right up to the edge of the mahogany table and sliding a stapled document out of her folder. You signed a post-nuptial waiver. Let us take a quick trip down memory lane, Terrence. 2 years ago, you received a substantial retention bonus from your corporate finance firm. You were absolutely terrified that the IRS was going to audit your accounts because you had been playing fast and loose with your tax deductions. You wanted to shield that bonus. You begged Zuri to help you hide the money in her quote-unquote freelance LLC to avoid bumping yourself into a higher tax bracket. Terrence's skin took on an ashen gray hue as the memory suddenly struck him. I watched his eyes dart toward the document in Kendra's hand. Zuri, being the deeply analytical woman, she has told you that mingling your funds with her corporate accounts required strict legal separation to avoid piercing the corporate veil. Kendra continued, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. She brought home a stack of documents drafted by my firm. She told you it was a tax liability form to protect your bonus from federal scrutiny. You were so blinded by your own greed, so desperate to cheat the government out of a few $1,000s that you did not even bother to read the fine print. Kendra flipped to the 3rd page of the document and tapped a freshly manicured fingernail against a bold black signature at the bottom of the sheet. You sat at this very dining table, Terrence, Kendra said. You drank a glass of bourbon, you joked about being a financial genius, and you signed a comprehensive, irrevocable post-nuptial agreement. In this document, you explicitly waived any and all current or future interest, right, or title to Zenith Holdings LLC, all of its subsidiary accounts, and all real property acquired by the holding company. You declared under penalty of perjury that you understood the terms, and you signed it in front of a licensed mobile notary who just happened to be my paralegal. Terrence snatched the document from the table, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. His eyes frantically scanned the dense legal jargon, searching for a loophole, a mistake, a way out. He read his own signature at the bottom of the page. He read the notary stamp. The reality of his own staggering hubris hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He had locked himself out of a $200 million empire because he was too arrogant to read a contract handed to him by the wife he thought was beneath him. This is fraud, Terrence yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. I was tricked. A judge will throw this out. I will tell the court. I signed it under false pretenses. I did not know what I was signing. You are a senior executive in corporate finance, Terrence, Kendra replied, her voice dropping to a lethal frozen calm. You literally negotiate complex financial contracts for a living. If you walk into a courtroom and tell a judge that you signed a binding legal document without reading it to hide money from the IRS, the judge will not just throw your divorce case out. They will forward the transcript directly to federal tax investigators. I highly recommend you do not test me on this. I win these cases for sport. Terence staggered backward, hitting the edge of his dining chair. The breath was knocked out of him. He was completely cornered. The legal trap had snapped shut around his ankles, and there was absolutely no way to chew his way out. He owned nothing. He was entitled to nothing. Vivian, watching her golden child getting systematically dismantled, could no longer contain her maternal indignation. She jumped up from her chair, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You deceptive, spiteful little girl!" Vivian shrieked, all her church-going refinement completely evaporating. "You planned this. You set my son up. We are going to hire the best lawyers in the state. We will tie you up in litigation for years. We will drag your name through the mud until you give him what he deserves." I turned my head slowly and fixed Vivian with a look of pure, absolute disgust. "With what money, Vivian?" I asked, my voice sharp and cutting. "Your son is officially broke. He spent his entire savings leasing luxury cars and buying expensive dinners to impress people who do not even like him. He cannot afford a retainer for a parking ticket, let alone a corporate litigation war against a firm with unlimited capital. Do not make empty threats in my house, Vivian. You are embarrassing yourself." Vivian's mouth snapped shut. She looked at Terence silently, begging him to say something to produce a counterattack to prove he still had some shred of power. But Terence was hyperventilating. He was gripping the back of his chair, his knuckles white, his chest heaving as he stared at the floor. The mighty breadwinner had been reduced to a gasping, panic-stricken shell of a man. The tension in the room rapidly shifted away from my decimated marriage and settled heavily onto the broader family dynamics. The illusion of their collective superiority had been shattered, and the fallout was causing instant collateral damage. Ashley, sensing the rapid collapse of the family she had married into, immediately began trying to distance herself from the wreckage. She scooted her chair an inch away from Jamal, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "I cannot believe you were stupid enough to sign something without reading it." "Terence," Ashley muttered, her voice laced with sudden toxic disdain. "This is exactly why Jamal handles all of our family contracts. You are an absolute idiot." She was trying to align herself with the winning side, attempting to secure her own fragile status by stepping on Terence's neck. She thought her husband was safe. She thought Jamal's corporate logistics salary made them untouchable to my wrath. She thought she could simply spectate this execution without getting blood on her designer dress. Jamal, however, was not experiencing the same arrogant detachment as his wife. Jamal was sweating. Large beads of perspiration were forming on his forehead. He was watching me with wide, terrified eyes. He had realized something fundamental in the last 10 minutes. He realized that a woman who secretly owned a $200 million private equity firm while quietly serving Sunday dinner did not execute a takedown this massive without tying up every single loose end. He realized that if I was willing to completely obliterate my husband, I was certainly not going to spare the brother-in-law who had enabled my disrespect for half a decade. I left Terence hyperventilating over his chair. He was no longer a threat. He was barely even a factor anymore. I turned my attention smoothly to the other side of the table, fixing my gaze on the sweating, panicked face of his older brother. "Jamal," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the dining room, "you might want to check your company's latest acquisition memo." Jamal froze. The piece of chicken he had been meticulously cutting slipped from his fork and hit the fine china with a sharp clatter. For the entire evening, he had perfected the art of the silent bystander. He had chewed his food and looked at the wall while his mother praised Terence for discarding me. He had sipped his wine while his wife told me to pack my belongings in trash bags. Jamal always believed that his silence protected him. I thought that as long as he did not actively throw the stones, he could not be held responsible for the bruising. He was a senior director at a mid-tier tech logistics firm, and he carried that title like a shield, believing his corporate status made him immune to the messy domestic drama unfolding across my dining table. I was wrong. His hand moved mechanically, diving into the pocket of his tailored slacks. He pulled out his smartphone. His fingers were shaking so violently that it took him 3 attempts to unlock the screen. The bright backlight illuminated the sudden, terrifying sheen of sweat coating his forehead. He opened his corporate email application. I did not need to see the screen to know exactly what was sitting at the top of his inbox. The email had been scheduled for automated distribution to all senior management at exactly 5 o'clock this evening. I knew this because I had personally drafted the final approval for the internal communication broadcast. Jamal stared at his phone, his eyes darting rapidly back and forth, reading the bold text of the internal memo. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. His mouth fell open slightly, but he could not seem to draw enough oxygen into his lungs to form a word. "What is it?" Ashley demanded, leaning heavily against his shoulder to peer at the screen. "What does the email say, Jamal? Why are you shaking?" Jamal slowly raised his head. He looked at me, not with the condescending pity he had worn for the last 5 years, but with absolute, unadulterated terror. He finally realized that the quiet black woman he had allowed his wife to degrade was not a victim. I was the apex predator in a financial ecosystem he barely understood. Zenith Holdings. I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. It is a beautiful name for a firm, do you not think so, Jamal? We look for companies that have solid infrastructure, but suffer from bloated, incompetent upper management. Companies that are bleeding revenue because their directors are too busy playing golf and taking long lunches to notice the shifting market. Your parent company fit that profile perfectly. Jamal swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. He gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. We started buying up your parent company debt quietly about 8 months ago. I continued maintaining my steady conversational tone. We leveraged the primary shareholders, identified the massive operational inefficiencies, and initiated a hostile takeover. The board tried to fight us, but they simply did not have the capital to withstand the pressure. We finalized the acquisition at the closing bell on Friday afternoon, exactly 48 hours ago. I took a slow step around the dining table, moving closer to where Jamal and Ashley sat frozen in their chairs. "So, Jamal," I said, letting the reality of my words sink into his bones. "When you walk into your glass corner office tomorrow morning, you will not be reporting to your usual vice president. You will be reporting to a transition team deployed by Zenith Holdings. Which means as of Friday afternoon, I am not just your sister-in-law. I am your boss's boss. I own your company. I own your department. I hold your entire professional career in the palm of my hand." The sound that escaped Ashley's throat was something between a gasp and a strangled scream. She snatched the phone out of Jamal's rigid hands and stared at the screen. She did not possess the financial literacy to understand the mechanics of a corporate buyout. But she understood the name Zenith Holdings glaring at her from the official company letterhead. She understood that the financial safety net she relied upon to fund her artificial upper-class lifestyle had just been snatched away by the very woman she had spent years racially profiling. Her entire identity was constructed around Jamal's 6-figure salary. It funded her luxury car lease, her country club lunches, and her desperate need to feel superior to everyone around her. The realization that her husband answered directly to me short-circuited her brain. "Do something," Ashley shrieked, shoving Jamal's shoulder. "Do not just sit there like a coward. Tell her she cannot do this. Tell her it is illegal." Jamal remained completely silent, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own vulnerability. He knew corporate law well enough to know that a hostile takeover was perfectly legal. He also knew that he had spent the last hour sitting silently while his family verbally abused the woman who now had the unilateral authority to liquidate his department. When Jamal failed to rise to her defense, Ashley turned her frantic, furious energy entirely onto me, her face contorted into a mask of pure white female fragility, weaponized by desperation. She jumped up from her chair, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You cannot do this!" Ashley screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "This is a massive conflict of interest. You are leveraging a corporate acquisition to settle a personal family dispute. That is highly illegal. I know my rights. You are creating a hostile work environment." I stopped walking and simply stared at her, letting her unravel completely. "I will call the labor board." Ashley threatened, her pitch rising higher and higher. "I will hire the best employment lawyer in this state. I will sue you and your holding company for workplace retaliation and discrimination. I will take you for every penny you have. You cannot just buy a company and use it to threaten my husband, because you are angry at Terrence. We will drag you into federal court." She was hyperventilating, clinging to the belief that the legal system would inherently protect her because of who she was. She thought throwing around buzzwords like discrimination and retaliation would force me to back down. She thought her tears and her screaming would somehow override the cold, hard reality of corporate authority. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at her threats. I simply looked at her with a level of cold detachment that made her stop screaming and take a sudden, terrified step backward. I do not fire people out of petty spite, Ashley. I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. I am a professional. I make decisions based entirely on data efficiency and corporate integrity. I do not care enough about your miserable existence to waste company resources on personal retaliation. I turned my attention away from her frantic face and locked my eyes onto Jamal. He had begun to shake, a deep, trembling shudder that racked his entire frame. He knew exactly what was coming. He knew that during an acquisition, a transition team conducts a merciless forensic audit of every single executive expense account. And he knew exactly what he had been hiding in his. But I do fire people, I continued, for corporate embezzlement. I do not fire people out of petty spite, Ashley, I said, keeping my voice at a low, dangerous calm that made her take a sudden, terrified step backward. I am a professional. I make decisions based entirely on data efficiency and corporate integrity. I do not care enough about your miserable existence to waste company resources on personal retaliation. I turned my attention away from her frantic, pale face and locked my eyes onto Jamal. He had begun to shake violently. A deep, trembling shudder racked his entire frame, causing his dress shirt to visibly vibrate against his chest. He knew exactly what was coming. He knew that during a corporate acquisition, my transition team conducts a merciless forensic audit of every single executive expense account. And he knew exactly what he had been desperately hiding in his. But I do fire people, I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the dining room. I fire people for corporate embezzlement. I picked up my tablet from the mahogany table and tapped the screen twice. The massive 85-inch television mounted on the wall behind me flickered. The Zenith Holdings corporate letterhead vanished instantly, replacing itself with a high-resolution, heavily color-coded forensic accounting spreadsheet. It was a beautiful, undeniable wall of hard data. I had my financial analysts pull this specific report on Friday night the moment the ink dried on the acquisition paperwork. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the television, pointing at the screen, so Jamal and Ashley were forced to look at their own ruin. When Zenith Holdings executes a hostile takeover, we immediately freeze and audit the last 36 months of upper management spending, I explained, treating the room like a boardroom presentation. Your husband Jamal is a senior director of logistics. It is a respectable mid-tier position that comes with a company credit card intended strictly for client dinners and necessary travel. However, Jamal has been exceptionally sloppy with his coding. Ashley looked at the screen, her eyes darting across the highlighted rows of numbers. She did not possess the financial literacy to understand complex corporate accounting, but she absolutely recognized the names of the luxury boutiques and five-star resorts listed on the television. Let us look at line item 42, I said, tapping the screen of my tablet to zoom in on a specific transaction. A $14,000 charge at a luxury designer boutique in Lenox Square. Jamal coded this as a consulting retention gift for a supply chain vendor. I turned around and looked directly at the flashy logo-covered handbag resting on the empty chair right next to Ashley. It was the exact same bag she had proudly paraded into my house an hour ago. The same bag she clutched while telling me to pack my thrift store clothes in garbage bags. That is a fascinating retention gift, Ashley, I said, tilting my head slightly. Because you are sitting right next to it. Tell me, did my logistics department also authorize the matching wallet, or did Jamal have to put that on your personal credit card? Ashley gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the handbag as if it had suddenly caught fire. The blood completely drained from her face. She looked at Jamal, silently begging him to deny it, to tell me I was making this up. Jamal just stared at his lap, a bead of sweat dripping off his chin and landing on his expensive slacks. Let us move down to line item 89. I continued relentlessly scrolling the spreadsheet. A $22,000 charge for a 10-day stay at a 5-star cliffside villa on the Amalfi Coast last summer. Expense to the company as an off-site supply chain optimization seminar with 3 foreign contractors. I walked right up to Ashley, leaning in just close enough for her to smell my perfume. You posted over 100 photos from that trip on your social media, Ashley. I remember seeing them. You bragged endlessly about how your husband treats you like a queen. You made a point to tag the resort and talk about how exclusivity is just a mindset. But there were no foreign contractors on that trip, were there? It was just you, Jamal, and a whole lot of stolen corporate funds fueling your desperate need to look wealthy on the internet. Ashley shrank back in her chair, looking physically ill. The illusion of her elite pedigree was evaporating into thin air. For 5 years, she had weaponized her husband's corporate salary against me, using it as a bludgeon to assert her racial and classist superiority. She had viewed me as a quiet, uneducated black woman who was lucky to be allowed in her presence. Now she was being completely dismantled by that same woman, realizing that her entire life of luxury was built on a foundation of desperate, pathetic theft. Jamal, I said, turning my back on his weeping wife. You were so terrified of losing her, so desperate to fund her artificial upper-class lifestyle that you committed federal wire fraud. You stole over $240,000 from your parent company over the last 3 years to buy her designer clothes and luxury vacations. Jamal finally looked up, his eyes wide and pleading. Zuri, please, he whispered, his voice cracking. I can pay it back. I just need time. Please do not do this to my family. I looked at him with absolute zero pity. You sat at my dining table and watched your wife tell me to put my clothes in garbage bags, Jamal. You watched your brother serve me fraudulent divorce papers. You did not protect my family, so I have absolutely no obligation to protect yours. I stood tall, projecting my voice so every syllable rang with absolute authority. Jamal, you are terminated from your position, effective immediately. You are stripped of your severance package, your stock options are voided, and your corporate access is already revoked. Furthermore, Zenith Holdings is filing a civil suit against you on Monday morning for the immediate recovery of the stolen funds. If you attempt to fight the civil suit, my legal team will hand this entire unredacted forensic audit directly over to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. You will not just be bankrupt, Jamal. You will go to prison. Ashley let out a loud, ugly sob, burying her face in her hands. The reality had finally crushed her. She was not a wealthy suburban socialite married to a high-powered executive. She was the wife of an unemployed thief who was about to be sued into absolute poverty. She would lose her heavily leveraged house. She would lose her leased luxury car. She would be forced to explain to her country club friends why she was suddenly shopping at discount grocery stores and facing bankruptcy. The utter destruction of his brother's life and the complete humiliation of his sister-in-law was suddenly too much for Terrence to bear. The spotlight had shifted away from him, and his ego simply could not handle being a spectator to someone else's ruin. He was drowning in his own massive failure, and he desperately needed to grab onto a raft made of his own arrogance to pull himself back to the surface. He needed to reassert his dominance over the room, to prove he was still the ultimate winner in this scenario. Terrence pushed himself violently up from his dining chair, his face flushed a furious dark red. He slammed his fist down on the mahogany table, rattling the crystal glasses, and pointed an aggressive finger at me, trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of pride he had left. I do not care about this house, Terrence yelled, his voice booming desperately over the sound of Ashley's pathetic sobbing. I do not care about your little holding company, and I do not care about Jamal losing his pathetic logistics job. You think you won something here, Zuri? You think taking this property makes you superior? I do not need a single dime of your money to live like a king. He puffed his chest out, trying to summon the arrogant corporate executive persona that had completely failed him all evening. I am leaving you for a real woman who actually brings massive money to the table. My new junior partner makes enough to support both of us effortlessly. And with my upcoming promotion to senior director at my corporate finance firm, I will be a millionaire by the end of the fiscal year anyway. I do not need you, I do not need this house, and I am going to build an empire with a woman who is actually on my level. I let his desperate screaming echo off the high ceilings of the dining room and fade into a pathetic, heavy silence. Terence was standing there with his chest puffed out, genuinely believing he had just delivered a masterful counterattack. In his frantic mind, he had found a loophole to preserve his fragile masculinity. If he could not claim my house, and if he could not leverage my company, he would simply pivot to a new source of validation. I was loudly declaring that his mistress, the junior partner at his corporate finance firm, was going to be his financial savior. He was happily throwing his own brother to the wolves, proudly stating he did not care about Jamal going to prison as long as he personally secured a promotion and walked away with a woman he deemed worthy of his pedigree. I watched the reaction of his family to this staggering display of selfish betrayal. Ashley, who was still sobbing quietly in her chair, suddenly stopped and looked up at her brother-in-law with an expression of pure, horrified disbelief. Jamal remained frozen, but a new layer of absolute devastation washed over his sweating face. Terence had just publicly announced that their financial ruin meant absolutely nothing to him as long as his own pockets were lined. He had sacrificed his own flesh and blood without a second thought just to score a petty verbal point against me. "You are going to build an empire, Terence," I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and dangerously calm. "You are going to build an empire with a junior partner at a firm where you are desperately praying for a senior director promotion." "That is exactly right," Terence snapped back, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "She brings real money to the table, Zuri. She brings corporate prestige. We are going to pool our resources, and within 6 months, we will have a portfolio that makes this house look like a starter home. You can keep your little holding company. I am stepping up to the major leagues." I did not laugh. I did not even smile. I simply picked up my tablet from the mahogany table and tapped the screen one final time. The 85-inch television mounted on the wall behind me flickered instantly, transitioning away from Jamal's forensic audit. The screen was immediately filled with a complex, cascading corporate organizational chart. It was a dense web of financial entities, holding companies, and funding structures connected by thick black lines indicating majority ownership and capital flow. I took a slow step to the side, allowing Terence a clear, unobstructed view of his own professional ecosystem. "Let us talk about the major leagues, Terence," I said, projecting my voice so every syllable rang with absolute clarity. "You work for a boutique corporate finance firm. You process mergers and acquisitions for mid-tier clients. You strut around in tailored suits acting like you own the financial district, but you lack a fundamental understanding of how your own employer operates. Your firm does not generate enough independent revenue to sustain its aggressive expansion strategy. Your managing partners rely entirely on rolling capital injections to make payroll to lease your fancy office space, and most importantly, to fund the lucrative promotions you are currently banking your entire future on." Terence narrowed his eyes, staring at the screen. He was trying to decipher the complex hierarchy of LLCs and corporate trusts floating above the name of his employer. "Look at the very top of that chart, Terence," I instructed, pointing a manicured finger at the screen. "Above your managing partners, above the regional directors, above the parent holding company that technically signs your paychecks. Do you see the name of the venture capital syndicate providing the primary liquidity for your entire operation?" Terrence's eyes tracked upward, following the solid black line to the apex of the corporate structure. The name Vanguard Horizon Partners sat at the very top, enclosed in a bold gold box indicating absolute majority control. "I know who Vanguard Horizon Partners is," Terrence sneered, trying to mask the sudden flutter of uncertainty in his voice. "They are a massive private equity syndicate. They hold the purse strings for half the corporate finance firms in Atlanta." "What is your point, Zuri? Are you trying to impress me by proving you know how to read a corporate filing?" "I work with Vanguard representatives every single quarter. I am practically on a first-name basis with their board of directors." "You do not know anyone on that board," Terrence, a new voice stated, slicing through the dining room with the chilling authority of a striking gavel. I stepped back seamlessly, yielding the floor. My mother Maxine moved away from the entryway. Her immaculate designer heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood as she approached the mahogany dining table. The 4 towering security guards shifted their stances slightly, adjusting to her movement, but maintaining their flawless perimeter. Maxine stopped exactly 3 feet away from Terrence. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply looked at him with the cold, assessing gaze of a woman analyzing a deeply flawed investment. You do not know anyone on the board of Vanguard Horizon Partners, Terrence? My mother continued her tone, radiating absolute untouchable power. Because if you did, you would know that the original founding partners were bought out in a highly classified aggressive acquisition exactly 18 months ago. You would know that the syndicate was restructured and brought under the umbrella of a single majority shareholder who currently dictates every single capital allocation directed toward your specific firm. Terrence's arms slowly uncrossed. The arrogant posture he had been desperately clinging to began to physically deflate. He looked from my mother to the television screen and back again. The gears in his head were grinding against each other, frantically trying to reject the impossible reality standing right in front of him. "What are you saying?" Terrence whispered, the color beginning to drain from his face for the third time this evening. "I am saying that I am the silent majority shareholder of Vanguard Horizon Partners," my mother declared, her voice ringing with the heavy, undeniable weight of a financial titan. "I own the capital that keeps your firm afloat, Terrence. I approve the operational budgets. I sign off on the executive bonuses. And I certainly dictate which mid-level corporate finance climbers get handed a senior director promotion and which ones get permanently stalled at the bottom of the ladder." Vivian let out a small, strangled gasp, pressing her hand over her mouth. She was staring at my mother as if Maxine had suddenly grown 10 feet tall. The woman Vivian had spent 5 years treating like a lower-class citizen, the woman whose modest lifestyle she had constantly mocked, was currently holding her son's entire professional existence hostage. "You mocked my broken-down Honda Civic, Terrence," my mother said, taking one slow, deliberate step closer to him. "You mocked my public school teacher pension. You sat on speakerphone less than an hour ago and told me to use that miserable pension to rent my useless daughter a cheap apartment. You thought your corporate title gave you the right to disrespect a black woman who built an empire while you were still trying to figure out how to tie a Windsor knot." Terrence opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He was suffocating under the crushing weight of his own profound arrogance. He had just bragged about building an empire with his mistress, completely oblivious to the fact that my mother owned the very ground they intended to build it on. "And let us discuss this, junior partner. You are so incredibly proud of," my mother continued, refusing to give him a single second to recover. "You think she is on your level. You think she brings massive money to the table. She is a recent hire brought on specifically because my board mandated a diversity expansion initiative at your firm. Her salary, her signing bonus, her entire position is funded directly by capital allocations that I personally authorized. You are planning to build a life with a woman whose paycheck is signed by the mother of the wife you just tried to throw away like garbage." The silence in the room was absolute. Terrence was trembling, a fine, violent vibration shaking his hands as he stared at the woman who controlled his destiny. He was completely trapped. He had no house. He had no claim to my wealth. He had alienated his brother. And now he was standing face to face with the billionaire who owned his career. My mother looked him up and down, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, merciless business acumen. She tilted her chin, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "My daughter wanted to build you up, Terrence," my mother said, her voice echoing with absolute terrifying authority. "She wanted to protect your pride and give you the illusion of power. But I have no such obligation. I pulled my funding exactly 1 hour ago," Maxine said, keeping her voice completely steady and entirely devoid of mercy. "At 4 o'clock this afternoon, while you were sitting at this table gorging yourself on the food my daughter cooked for you, I instructed my board of directors to execute a total capital withdrawal. We liquidated our position in Vanguard Horizon Partners, and we officially severed all financial lifelines to your boutique firm. The withdrawal was massive, immediate, and completely unmitigated. Your managing partners were notified via urgent courier just before the close of business today. They are currently locked in a frantic emergency board meeting, realizing that their operational accounts have been frozen and they cannot even cover the basic payroll for Monday morning." Terrence stared at my mother, his mouth hanging slightly open as he struggled to draw oxygen into his rapidly constricting lungs. The tailored suit he had worn like a badge of absolute superiority suddenly looked like a cheap, oversized costume draping awkwardly over his collapsing frame. He was watching his entire identity being dismantled brick by brick, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop the demolition. "Your firm is insolvent, Terrence," my mother stated, driving the final nail into the coffin of his corporate career. "It is effectively dead. They will be filing for bankruptcy protection before the end of the fiscal quarter. You do not have a job. You do not have a promotion waiting for you. You do not have a six-figure salary to leverage against my daughter. And neither does your shiny new junior partner. She was hired on my dime, and her position was eradicated the exact second I pulled my capital. You threw away a brilliant, loyal wife to build an empire with a woman who is now just as broke and unemployed as you are." The absolute silence in the dining room was heavy enough to crush bone. Nobody dared to breathe. Vivian had pressed both hands over her mouth, tears of profound humiliation finally spilling over her cheeks and ruining her expensive makeup. She was mourning the sudden violent death of her bragging rights. Jamal was staring blankly at the floor, thoroughly destroyed by his own looming prison sentence, while Ashley sat perfectly still, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the financial bloodbath surrounding her. Then a sharp, jarring sound sliced through the suffocating quiet. It was the bright, cheerful marimba ringtone of Terrence's smartphone. The device was still sitting on the mahogany dining table, right next to the rejected divorce papers and my discarded wedding ring. The screen lit up, vibrating aggressively against the polished wood. Terrence flinched as if the phone had suddenly electrocuted him. He looked down at the glowing screen, and the last remaining drop of blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. "Answer it," my mother commanded, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Terrence shook his head slowly, a pathetic gesture of denial. His hands remained frozen at his sides. He knew exactly who was calling. He knew exactly why she was calling. "I said answer it," Maxine repeated, taking one slow step toward him. "Or I will have Kendra answer it for you, and she will put it on speakerphone anyway." Terrence swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively. His shaking hand reached out across the table. His fingers fumbled against the smooth glass of the screen, struggling to swipe the green icon to accept the call. He brought the phone to his ear, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He did not even have the chance to say hello. The audio bled through the phone speaker loud enough for every single person in the quiet dining room to hear every single frantic, hysterical syllable. It was the junior partner. She was not using her polished, professional corporate voice. She was screaming. It was a raw, desperate shriek of pure, unadulterated panic and fury. "Terrence, what the hell is going on?" the woman screamed, her voice cracking sharply over the line. "I just got escorted out of the building. Security literally marched into my office, handed me a cardboard box and told me I had 5 minutes to pack my desk. They deactivated my keycard. Terrence, they told me the firm is liquidating. My position is gone. My signing bonus is being recalled. What did you do?" Terrence opened his mouth, trying to formulate a response, trying to offer some kind of reassurance or explanation, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He just let out a dry, pathetic wheeze. "You told me you had everything under control." The mistress shrieked, the sound of heavy traffic and honking cars audible in the background, indicating she was standing on the street outside their corporate building. "You told me you were serving your wife papers today, and that we were going to take over this city. You said your wife was a nobody, a useless housewife. You did not tell me her family owned the entire venture capital syndicate that funds our paychecks, Terrence. The managing partners are screaming in the boardroom. They are blaming you. They said Vanguard pulled their capital because of a personal conflict. What did you do to us?" Terrence squeezed his eyes shut, a tear of pure, overwhelming defeat slipping down his cheek. "I did not know," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic whimper. "I swear to God I did not know." "You ruined my life!" the woman sobbed, her anger rapidly shifting into absolute despair. "I gave up a secure position at my old firm for this diversity initiative role. I leveraged my entire professional reputation for this job, and for you, I believed you when you said you were going to be a senior director. You are a fraud. Terrence, you are an arrogant, stupid fraud. I never want to see your face again. Do not call me. Do not text me. We are done. You are completely on your own." The line went dead with a sharp final click. The dial tone echoed through the dining room, a bleak mechanical sound that perfectly encapsulated the vast empty void where Terrence's entire future used to be. The junior partner, the woman he had proudly flaunted as his intellectual and financial equal, the woman he had planned to build a new elite life with, had just publicly discarded him the exact same way he had tried to discard me. She did not love him unconditionally. She loved the corporate title and the financial trajectory he had promised her. The second that trajectory was annihilated, her loyalty evaporated into thin air. Terrence stood frozen, his hand still holding the silent phone against his ear. He was completely disconnected from reality. His brain could no longer process the catastrophic sequence of events that had systematically dismantled his entire life in the span of 30 minutes. He had walked into this dining room feeling like an absolute king. He had looked down on me, mocking my clothing, my career, and my family. He had demanded $50 million with the arrogant certainty of a man who believed the world owed him everything. Now he had absolutely nothing. The phone slowly slipped from his trembling fingers. It fell, hitting the edge of the mahogany table before tumbling down and cracking against the hardwood floor. Terrence's knees finally gave out entirely. He did not simply sit down, he collapsed. He fell forward, his legs folding beneath him until his knees hit the floor with a heavy, dull thud. His tailored suit jacket bunched up awkwardly around his shoulders. He slumped forward, resting his hands on the floor, staring blankly at the wood grain, completely broken and utterly defeated. I was kneeling at my feet in the dining room of the house that I owned. I looked down at him, feeling no anger, no sadness, and absolutely no pity. I just felt a profound, clinical detachment. I looked past his kneeling figure and surveyed the rest of the room. Vivian was weeping openly, her face buried in her hands, mourning the loss of the affluent lifestyle she thought she had secured through her son. Ashley was curled into a tight ball in her chair, completely paralyzed by the looming reality of federal fraud investigations and absolute bankruptcy. Jamal was staring into the void, his corporate logistics career reduced to a smoking crater. They were a family that had built their entire identity on a foundation of arrogance, entitlement, and racial superiority. They had thrived on making others feel small so they could feel significant. Now that foundation had been ripped out from under them, exposing them as the hollow, pathetic frauds they truly were. They were utterly ruined, and they had brought every single ounce of that ruin upon themselves. Terrence's hands shook as his thumb broke the seal of the pristine white envelope Kendra had just pressed against his chest. He pulled out the crisp legal document and unfolded it. His eyes darted across the top of the page, reading the bold lettering of a formal civil complaint filed in Fulton County Superior Court. The document was a lawsuit for the intentional dissipation of marital assets. I stepped forward, my designer heels clicking against the marble floor of the foyer, standing right next to my brilliant attorney. "I did not leave anything to chance, Terrence," I told him, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal calm. "You genuinely believed that because you were the one engaging in an affair, you held all the cards. You thought you could spend the last 6 months playing the wealthy bachelor, showering your junior partner with gifts and hotel stays, while coming home to eat the meals I cooked for you. But you forgot who you were married to. I am the sole proprietor of a private equity firm. My entire professional life is built on tracking capital flow, identifying financial leaks, and executing forensic audits. You really thought I would not notice the discrepancies in our shared financial ecosystem." Terrence opened his mouth to deny it, but I cut him off instantly. "I know exactly where every single dollar went." I continued reciting the data from memory, with absolute precision. "I know about the weekend suite at the St. Regis you booked in mid-October. I know about the $2,000 dinner at Bacchanalia. I know about the diamond tennis bracelet you purchased at Phipps Plaza just 3 weeks ago. You spent over $45,000 of liquid capital on your mistress over the last 6 months. And because you are an arrogant fool, you used funds that were legally classified as marital property to do it." Kendra stepped in seamlessly, taking over the legal execution. "Georgia law takes a very dim view of spouses who funnel marital assets into illicit affairs," she explained, her tone dripping with professional disdain. "We are suing you for the immediate restitution of every single penny you spent on that woman. But that is not even the best part, Terrence. Because you were so desperate to impress her, You pulled those funds directly from the same accounts where you had previously attempted to shield your corporate bonuses from federal taxation. You created a highly documented paper trail of financial manipulation. The color completely drained from Terrence's face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out shell. He looked from Kendra to me, his eyes wide with a new profound level of terror. When we file this lawsuit into public record, Kendra continued smoothly, my team is legally obligated to report the financial irregularities to the Internal Revenue Service. We are handing them a perfectly packaged audit of your tax evasion tactics. You are not just leaving this marriage with zero assets, Terrence. You are leaving with a massive negative net worth. You will owe my client complete restitution for the dissipated funds. You will owe the federal government staggering penalties and back taxes. You do not have a job. You do not have a mistress to support you. You have absolutely no way to pay these debts. You are going to be bankrupt before the end of the year, and you will likely face criminal tax fraud charges. Terrence crumpled the legal document in his fist. He was completely defeated. Every single arrogant boast he had made earlier in the evening had been systematically dismantled and weaponized against him. The corporate finance climber who had obsessed over his pedigree and his earning potential was now a broke, unemployed tax evader carrying his belongings in trash bags. Vivian, who was standing behind him clutching her designer purse, let out a loud, pathetic sob. She had raised her son to believe he was a king, and she was now watching him get dethroned, exiled, and financially ruined all in the span of an hour. Jamal and Ashley stood completely silent, thoroughly terrified that if they made even a single sound, I would turn my attention back to them and find a new way to destroy their lives. I gestured toward the open front door. Your 30 minutes are up, Terrence, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Get off my property. Terrence turned around slowly, his shoulders slumped, his spirit completely broken. He stepped out onto the front porch, the heavy black garbage bag slung over his shoulders. His family followed him like a procession of the damned. Vivian walked with her head bowed, her tears ruining her expensive silk blouse. Jamal practically dragged Ashley out the door, desperate to escape the gravitational pull of my authority. Terrence walked down the front steps and headed toward the driveway, fully intending to load his garbage bags into his pristine white-leased BMW. But he stopped dead in his tracks the second his leather shoes hit the concrete. He had been so consumed by his own financial destruction inside the house that he had completely forgotten the physical reality waiting for him outside. His leased BMW was entirely boxed in. My mother's fleet of 6 midnight black long-wheelbase Cadillac Escalades formed an impenetrable wall of armored steel around his vehicle. There was absolutely no way to open the doors, let alone reverse the car out of the driveway. The towering security guards stood by the SUVs, their arms crossed over their chests, watching him with blank, unyielding expressions. Terrence dropped his garbage bags onto the driveway with a heavy thud. He looked back at the house, staring at me as I stood in the doorway, framed by the warm light of the foyer. Move the cars, Terrence pleaded, his voice cracking with humiliation. Please, Zuri, just let me take my car and leave. I shook my head slowly, a tiny cold smile playing on my lips. Those vehicles belong to my mother's security detail, Terrence, I replied. They are maintaining a secure perimeter until she decides to depart. You do not dictate their movements. I highly suggest you pull out your phone and request a ride-share service. But you might want to choose the economy option. You really need to start watching your budget. I did not wait to see his reaction. I simply stepped back into my beautiful, quiet foyer and pulled the heavy custom oak door shut. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt locking into place sounded like absolute glorious finality. Through the sidelight windows, I watched Terrence standing under the dim glow of the street lamp, pulling out his smartphone with trembling hands to order an Uber, while his mother wept silently beside a pile of heavy-duty black garbage bags. The click of the deadbolt sent a shockwave of profound peace cascading through the entire house. The suffocating toxic energy that had plagued my home for the last 5 years was instantly surgically removed. The air felt lighter, easier to breathe. I stood in the foyer for a long moment, simply absorbing the absolute stillness. I closed my eyes, letting the reality of my freedom wash over me. I was no longer a supporting character in an arrogant man's fabricated narrative. I was no longer shrinking my intelligence, dulling my shine, or hiding my massive success to protect the fragile ego of a partner who secretly despised my greatness. I was the sole author of my own life, and I had just reclaimed my narrative with flawless execution. I opened my eyes and turned around, walking back into the dining room. My mother Maxine was standing near the head of the mahogany table. Kendra was quietly packing her legal documents back into her slim leather briefcase. The picture of consummate professionalism, closing out another highly successful transaction. The dining room table was a chaotic monument to the evening's destruction. The crystal wine glasses were half empty. The fine china plates were pushed aside. And right in the center of the table, sitting on top of the ruined plate of smothered chicken, was the gravy-stained manila envelope containing Terrence's pathetic, useless divorce papers. Next to it sat my platinum diamond wedding ring glittering under the light of the imported chandelier. It looked incredibly small now. Just a piece of compressed carbon and metal that used to represent a lifelong commitment to a man who had never truly seen me. I walked over to the table and picked up the ring, tossing it carelessly into a nearby decorative bowl. I would have it melted down later and repurposed into something beautiful, something entirely for me. Maxine stepped up beside me, her flawless camel hair coat brushing against my shoulder. She looked down at the ruined Sunday dinner, her dark eyes scanning the collateral damage of my liberation. She had driven across the city with a private security team ready to go to war for her daughter, and she had watched me systematically dismantle every single person who had ever caused me pain. There was a quiet, fierce pride radiating from her posture. "You handled that beautifully, Zuri," my mother said, her voice soft, rich, and filled with maternal admiration. "You built a spectacular life for yourself, and you protected it exactly the way I taught you to. You never have to make yourself small for anyone ever again." I looked at my mother, feeling a sudden, overwhelming surge of gratitude. She had endured the blatant disrespect of Terrence and his family for years, sitting silently at this very table, letting them mock her public school teacher pension. She had allowed them to believe she was beneath them entirely, because she knew I loved my husband, and she wanted to respect my marriage. She had kept her venture capital empire a total secret, sacrificing her own ego to protect my peace. But the absolute second Terrence crossed the line the moment he tried to throw me away, she had descended upon his reality like a hurricane of black excellence and corporate power. "I am sorry you had to listen to their disrespect for so long," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. "I should have ended the charade years ago." Maxine reached out and gently cupped my cheek, her thumb brushing across my skin. "Do not apologize for trying to love someone, Zuri," she said softly. "You gave him every opportunity to be a king. It is not your fault he preferred to be a clown. Now the trash has taken itself out and we have much better things to focus on." She turned her gaze back to the cold, ruined dinner sitting on the table. The smell of the candied yams and the collard greens had faded, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of victory. "We have reservations at Del Frisco's," my mother announced, her tone instantly shifting back to the commanding authority of a billionaire CEO. "The private dining room is waiting for us. Let us leave this trash behind and go celebrate your rebirth." I smiled, feeling a bright, genuine warmth blooming in my chest. I turned around and grabbed my designer handbag from the chair. I did not bother cleaning up the table. I did not bother clearing away the plates or throwing away Terrence's ridiculous paperwork. I would hire a cleaning service tomorrow to scrub the entire house from top to bottom, erasing every single trace of his existence from my property. I walked out of the dining room, flanked by the two most powerful women in my life. Kendra led the way through the foyer, opening the heavy front door and stepping out into the cool evening air. I followed her, pulling the door shut behind me and securing the locks. The driveway was perfectly clear now. Terrence, Vivian, Jamal, and Ashley were completely gone, their garbage bags and their shattered egos swallowed up by the darkness of the suburban streets. Only my mother's impressive fleet of midnight black Escalades remained, their engines purring softly in the quiet night. The security team stood at attention, holding the doors open for us. I walked down the concrete path, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. I did not look back at the house. I stepped into the spacious, luxurious rear cabin of the lead flagship SUV, sinking into the plush leather seating. The heavy door closed silently, shutting out the outside world completely. My mother settled into the seat across from me. She reached into the customized center console and pulled out a chilled bottle of premium vintage champagne and two crystal flutes. The cork popped with a bright festive sound, filling the cabin with the scent of celebration. She poured the golden bubbling liquid into the glasses and handed one to me. I took the crystal flute, holding it up in the ambient glow of the vehicle's interior lighting. My ring finger was completely bare, and it felt incredibly light. I was no longer hiding my $200 million private equity firm. I was no longer pretending to be a useless housewife. I was stepping fully into my power, unapologetic, untouchable, and financially invincible. My mother raised her glass, tapping the rim gently against mine. To Zenith Holdings, she toasted, her eyes sparkling with absolute triumph. And to knowing your exact worth. To knowing my exact worth, I repeated, bringing the cool champagne to my lips. The driver smoothly shifted the massive vehicle into gear, and the convoy of black SUVs pulled away from the curb, gliding seamlessly through the gated community. I leaned back into the leather seat, taking another sip of my drink, and watched the neighborhood disappear behind tinted glass. I was leaving the wreckage of a small, arrogant man completely in my rearview mirror and driving straight into a brilliant, limitless future alongside the mother who always had my back. The greatest lesson to extract from this ordeal isn't just about the sweetness of revenge. It is about the undeniable power of silent strategy and unshakable self-worth. For years, Zuri shrank her brilliance to accommodate a fragile ego, believing that love required her to play small. But shrinking yourself to make someone else feel big only invites them to step on you. The profound takeaway here is the absolute necessity of financial and emotional independence. When you build your own table, you never have to beg for a seat. More importantly, you retain absolute control over who gets evicted when they violate the house rules. Toxic family dynamics thrive on enabling bad behavior and tearing down the scapegoat to protect a fabricated golden child. Terrence and his family operated on the delusion that loud arrogance equates to power. They mistook Zuri's quiet grace for weakness, completely failing to realize that the most devastating and permanent moves are always made in total silence. Real power does not need to scream. It does not need to post flashy photos online or belittle others to validate its existence. Real power is having the receipts, the ironclad legal backing, and the supreme confidence to let toxic people talk themselves right into a corner. When someone shows you they value your destruction over your dignity, do not argue with them. Let them dig their own grave, hand them the heavy-duty garbage bags, and then calmly pave over their arrogance with your undeniable success. Never compromise your potential to appease someone else's insecurities. Build your empire quietly, secure your assets legally, and remember that you are the sole author of your narrative. Your dignity is not up for negotiation, and your peace is worth protecting at all costs. Stand tall in your truth, and never apologize for outgrowing the rooms you were once forced to shrink in. What high-stakes family conflict scenario should we outline for your next dramatic script to keep your audience